author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We've got quite the show for you, so let's just get straight into it. Here you are listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard on WWRC in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, to discuss the cost of an election. Now, we're not talking about dollars and cents in terms of what a candidate pays out, but Tim, you wrote a fantastic piece on Liberty Nation this last week discussing the power of the purse for the president. And it was really quite an eye-opener. Not that we didn't know the things that you were talking about, but how you laid it out. And it just really, I think anybody who is just a fraction more cynical than myself, Tim, might consider that the current president is trying to bribe the electorate. Your thoughts?
Well, bribe is a pretty strong word. But if you use it in quotes or you use it in a political context, it certainly is. I mean, you know, as you run through it, you see what Biden has tried to do in his bid for a second term. I mean, if he had stuck with what he did in his inaugural address, which was a call for unity at least 16 different times, he might be sitting in the catbird seat looking for a second term. But instead, what he did was he called for unity, and then he called half the country semi-fascists. So that didn't work. He tried Build Back Better, of course, but the inflationary spiral of the trillions that they were throwing at the post-pandemic period led to inflation, rising prices, making life unaffordable. He has tried, in what was the most fateful decision, he tried to, shall we say, encourage his Justice Department and progressive prosecutors in several different venues to simply arrest him, try to imprison him, or bankrupt him. And none of that has worked. As a matter of fact, it's all backfired. So what's a president to do when he is losing basically on every issue except abortion? He's underwater with groups that he dominated in 2020, the young and Hispanics and Black voters. So what's he to do? Well, he is certainly suffering from incumbency because he has an actual record he has to defend, and it's not a very good one, according to most American people. So put all of that together, plus the fact that you have this radical spreading of violence and anti-Semitic protests, which kind of cancel out the January 6th issue, don't they? In terms of mob violence. And all he has left is his pen and his phone and his bag of goodies.
His bag of taxpayer-funded goodies. Let's be very clear on that one.
Taxpayer-funded goodies. And so he got the downside of incumbency with his record. Now he gets the upside, which is he can simply buy off voters with various policies that he makes up or changes. The first one, of course, was student loan debt forgiveness. And you'd be forgiven, dear listener or viewer, for saying, wait a minute, he already tried that and he couldn't get away with it. Well, he's back for more at the Supreme Court with altered parameters on student loan forgiveness, which we are assured fall well within the law. We shall see.
If I just jump in on that one, Tim, the reality is it doesn't actually matter if it ends up falling well within the law, because that case is not going to be heard until, well, certainly a decision is not going to come down until well after the November election. So he can campaign on, hey, look, I'm forgiving your debt, me, Uncle Joe Biden, I'm forgiving your debt with, and of course, don't look at the poor taxpayer who's shouldering it. And then it doesn't matter if the Supreme Court sends down a ruling on November 6th and it says this is basically just unconstitutional, same as the last one that you tried,
Oh,
Joe
gee,
Biden.
tough luck, but we
Doesn't
tried.
matter. I
We
tried,
tried.
right? I tried.
Yes,
But
yes, he tried.
that
So
conservative-led Supreme Court.
I think you can't even the least cynical, most naive observer would have to see this as nothing more than trying to put a jingle in the pocket of student loan debtors who will be forgiven at the taxpayer expense. Now, that's just one thing, though. Then you have to go to at least two other buyouts that Biden has tried in an attempt to get Democratic defectors to come back. And the second thing is something that was on the table for a long time but never seriously addressed, and that is the decriminalization of marijuana at the federal level. And of course, the young are notoriously have the highest rate of marijuana consumption in the country. So this is a naked attempt to get them to say, well, old Uncle Joe kind of gets it, maybe we'll change our minds and go back and vote for him, even though he has behaved shamefully in the Israel-Hamas war. So that was the second thing.
Sorry, I just want to jump on that one as well.
Not legal, but decriminalized. In other words, it used to be on the same federal schedule as heroin and LSD. Yeah. And now it has been lowered to a schedule with less
or will be is the
proposal.
Yes. The funny thing is that this is really just a political decision because it's the federal law on it, right? That the federal regulation on it. So on day one of his presidency, Joe Biden could have said, we're lowering the schedule on this, so people won't be federally prosecuted. Not that many are, but people won't be federally prosecuted.
Well, it's just a coincidence.
Could have done it first day.
He just
waited until he's underwater in the polls.
It's just a coincidence, Mark, that he didn't get around to it until the middle of his re-election campaign.
What's the third one, Tim?
Well, the third one in this rule of three is, let's see if people remember this, because it's back in the headlines, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which, of course, was a political hot potato during the Trump years, the first Trump term. And he actually, unbeknownst to most people, Trump actually made a bid to bring DACA, which are the descendants of illegal immigrants, into the fold and is part of an immigration deal. But of course, the left didn't want to do that because then Trump would get credit for a DACA reform. But again, that's something that Joe Biden could have done on day one. He didn't, and he just is getting around to it now in the middle of a re-election campaign. So it's nice being an incumbent, Mark.
Yeah. So you've got the rule of three there, Tim. You've got the student loans, marijuana, deregulation, and DACA recipients getting that Medicare money, that Obamacare money. And I'm reminded of Ian Fleming writing for James Bond. Once is coincidence, twice is happenstance, third time's enemy action. We'll be right back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, joined by a longtime host of this here show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking the cost of an election and what a president with a phone and a pen can do to bolster his chances of re-election. But now I want to move on to something that really is very much in the news this week. And these are the cases against another president, a former president, Donald Trump. And it seems to me, Tim, that this whole 4 indictments, 91 felony charges, Trump's going to prison, all of the Twitterverse, Xverse, I guess it's now called, alight with, we've got him this time. it seems to just be crumbling, doesn't it? Like a poorly made house of cards. What's
I'd
your
say
take?
that's a good description because in each and every case brought against Trump this year, 4 cases with a total of 91 felony charges. In each case, things are crumbling, though in different ways. The case in Georgia is crumbling because Fani Willis was obviously in an inappropriate relationship with the original prosecutor, and she has been stained, perhaps irreparably, and her case is consequently weakened. The federal prosecutor in the documents case has now postponed that trial, which means it's probably not going to be a factor in the election. And in New York, where Trump is forced to sit day after day and watch the proceedings, this week, when they brought in Stormy Daniels herself and she provided all the lurid details of her likely one night stand with Donald Trump. Of course, he denies everything. But when they did that, they, I think, poisoned the case, perhaps beyond repair. The defense for Donald Trump went for a mistrial, and I think if it wasn't Donald Trump, it might well have been granted because of the utterly gratuitous and irrelevant comments of Stormy Daniels. I mean, the prosecution is desperate because every single one of their own witnesses that they've called by subpoena or who came in by choice have weakened their case rather than strengthening it. So this whole lawfare project is falling apart. And it's not just that it has failed, but in fact, Mark, it's produced the opposite of the desired result, which is making Donald Trump something inconceivable, a subject of sympathy, a victim in the eyes of the American people. Everybody can see what's going on. Republicans, Democrats, independents. Yeah. They can all see what's going on. It has failed. And now pretty much all Joe Biden has left is to try and buy off various constituencies that are abandoning the Democrats in droves.
I think it was judging by the polling at the moment, the only thing that could really damage Donald Trump's re-election chances is Donald Trump. I think we've talked about this before. But before, it was these cases, they were talked about so seriously, but it's as you say, I mean, neither of us are lawyers, Tim, but it does seem, and if it seems this way to us, who are very keen analysts of politics, if it seems this way to us, it's got to be seeming at least somewhat similar to the voting public out there. And when you say fatally flawed, I think it even goes beyond that. It's almost kamikazely flawed, if I may use the term. So you had, as you just mentioned, Stormy Daniels describing every lurid act imaginable in a case that is about a misfiling of paperwork. Now, for those of you with memories longer than a couple of weeks, Harvey Weinstein, his conviction was overturned because during his trial, witnesses came forward and essentially assassinated his character, which I have no love for Harvey Weinstein. I don't know anything about him, but and began talking about lurid stories about him, and that prejudiced the jury. It prejudiced the jury, and therefore it was overturned.
He was let go.
Yeah.
And it's a very good analogy, Mark, because we're looking at the same kind of situation. I mean, it's gotten so bad, it's backfired and boomeranged on the Biden administration so badly that, let me put it this way, if this was an ordinary election with ordinary candidates, not one who's borderline on compos mentis and another one who is the most bombastic and controversial figure of modern times, Donald Trump would likely be looking at a landslide victory here. When you consider that Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden on every single issue except abortion. Democracy is no longer an issue because look at what's happening on with campus unrest across the country. That is chaos of a kind that was not limited to 1 day and 2 hours like January 6th. And you look at the fact that blacks have given Trump twice the vote they gave him in 2020, according to polls. Young people who voted for Biden by over 40 points in 2020 now favor Donald Trump, and Hispanics are basically split 50-50 with a guy who most famously began his campaign by talking about Mexicans as rapists and all that stuff. So if it wasn't Donald Trump under all these indictments and the fact that it's Trump and there's so many people that just hate him so intensely and deeply and personally, this is a landslide election because of Joe Biden, if not because of Donald Trump. That doesn't mean it will be, but there's literally nothing except scaring people about abortion that Joe Biden has left in his cookie jar.
Well, we talked about Joe Biden's record earlier, and something that popped into my head were the two big pushes of the Biden presidency. Now, see if you can remember this far back. When was the last time anybody on the left mentioned Build Back Better? It's been months, right?
The last time I saw it mentioned was in my own article on libertynation.com. And I had to look it up because I'd forgotten. Just kidding. But the point is, that was, of course, the big slogan in 2020. And the way that he was going to fulfill that promise was throwing $2 trillion at the American people, which ramped
and what did that result in, Tim?
Inflation and something that he won't be able to get out from under before the election. I think that his record on the economy, inflation, prices is so poor and so unpopular, it's hard to imagine, honestly, Joe Biden getting reelected on that alone, not to mention the border on fire and all of academia having all but surrendered to a radical mob.
Well, let's very briefly, let's bring up Joe Biden's other re-election plank that surpassed and supplanted Build Back Better, Bidenomics. When was the last time you heard that muttered?
Well, Mark, in fact, just like with the lawfare campaign against Trump, this has backfired and produced not just a failure, but the opposite of what was trying to be achieved. Bidenomics simply drew attention to the fact that everybody was unhappy with the Biden economy, and putting a face on it made it worse rather than better.
Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being here.
Pleasure.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Racking up fine after fine for contempt of court, Donald J. Trump faces the wrath of the judge, or is it the wrath of the Constitution? That's what we're here to find out with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott Casenta. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. My pleasure.
So, Scott, the background here, Donald Trump is in court and at time of recording has received 10 fines of $1,000 each for various contempts of court. Now, I guess what we really want to dig into is just how constitutional is it to fine someone for speaking about their personal circumstances?
Yes, this is an area that is largely untested because most of the cases involve people who don't have ongoing presidential campaigns and giant social media
I'd say a very large
followers,
percentage don't have ongoing presidential campaigns.
So typically a witness who may grouse about, being locked down with their speech, the locking of that speech down doesn't affect so much else in their life like it does with Donald Trump. Sort of his stock in trade is his quick quips and punching back twice as hard against people that are punching him verbally or otherwise. And so it's a different animal altogether. It's, you know, this is a special prosecution for Donald Trump, and he's, you know, obligated to special rules regarding its prosecution.
So I think we need to dig into it really what
And
a
just in case
gag.
that wasn't clear, that was me being sarcastic and saying that the special prosecution is one that any other American would not have to undergo. This is totally and and exclusively about politics, demonstrated, Mark, by the idea that Stormy Daniels is brought in to testify when there is no discrepancy over the facts regarding her testimony, which is to say, the existence of the hush money agreement that everybody likes to call it is not in dispute. Trump hasn't said that he hasn't engaged in a hush money agreement. And so Ms. Daniels never discussed the agreement with Mr. Trump in advance of its signing or afterwards. So what does she have to offer testimony? Well, tons and tons of headlines and salaciousness and getting, you know, some extramarital affair into the record for the prosecution. It seems like there is no legal justifiable reason for it, except to embarrass Donald Trump.
Well, actually, there's another reason here, Scott. And I might be wrong on this because, and I've got to say this again. I say this every episode where we have these legal discussions. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But
you've distinguished yourself in that regard. I appreciate it.
I've distinguished myself in not being a lawyer. Thank you. I'm also
famously Jimmy McNulty in the brilliant TV series The Wire was accused of being a lawyer. Somebody said, "You're not a lawyer," and he said, "Why would anybody pretend to be a lawyer who wasn't one?" As if it was a disease. And I appreciated that in any case.
Okay, so here's an angle that maybe is right or wrong, but you tell me what you think. By bringing in Stormy Daniels, who, as you say, doesn't have any bearing on how Donald Trump filed his paperwork because she had no contact with him regarding his filing of the paperwork, and other witnesses, this is stopping Donald Trump talking about pretty much anything that he might want to talk about. So, for example,
it's almost, Mark, as if the entire exercise was devised not as an effort to deliver justice to the people of New York or against a malefactor like Donald Trump, but instead to hobble his political ambitions and frustrate his campaign for president. It's almost like it was designed exclusively to accomplish that goal. Now, we know that can't be true because that would be counter to notions of justice that all those prosecutors and the Judge Merchant are sworn to uphold. And yet somehow it just seems exactly like that.
Pure coincidence, Scott. I'm absolutely sure of it. So yeah, by bringing in all these other witnesses, he's essentially not allowed to talk about these witnesses. Now, I want to talk about what he has talked about and why these contempt acts apply. And specifically because you and I can talk about what he talked about. In fact, Washington, D.C.'s most notable newspaper literally listed every single thing that Donald Trump has said and been fined for contempt with. Now, my understanding here, Scott, is a gag order is there to allow, and this is very loose definition, of course, is for allow the betterment of the judicial proceedings to continue, right? It's to stop any hindrance against a legal process, illegally processing and legal process. But so, for example, if you have a mafioso captain, obviously every school child in America knows the mafia don't exist, but let's not go there. If you had a mafioso captain, a capo di tutti, capo, and he wanted
you're not
to,
doing well with the nomenclature, Mark.
I have read every piece of work that Mario Puzo has ever done. Thank you very much. And that's
a capo is just a capo. Okay, so there you go.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's say one of these non-existent mafioso captains, let's say they were being brought before the court and they wanted to intimidate a witness, and they would say something along the lines of, you know, it'd be a real shame if anything happened to the witness and his family. That would just be a crying shame if their house for some reason just burnt down. That's what a gag order's for, right?
Well, that actually is a veiled threat. And so I think that the the gag order is actually for a lower standard than that thinly veiled threat. It would be more like the people in this office are all, scum or liars or something like that, and refer to, some identifiable small group of people just to induce hate and scorn and frustrate their kind of existence,
Okay, well, let's go with that standard for my hypothetical here then.
Yeah.
So
Because with your hypothetical, that would just be seen, I think, as a veiled threat, and it could be prosecuted that way.
Okay.
Rather than a more subtle or non-threat, just something that's designed to frustrate somebody's existence in terms of,
Okay,
their
so
testimony.
that this actually even fits better in with my scenario here. So Donald Trump can't say these things, right? Because he's in contempt of court, because it serves a specific purpose that the judge does not want to happen. And yet, every media outlet in the entire country can reprint these things. So therefore, the net effect of what he said is
Yeah.
is
So what you're struggling
multiplied
with, let me interrupt here
because
and just
every
say,
media outlet in the country is doing it because it's under the gag order.
right. So Donald Trump's free speech rights are impinged because he is in a criminal trial. This is not up for debate. There's no, that's not a revelation to anyone. The question is whether that's okay, given the circumstances, I think. But there's no dispute over whether there is an impingement on First Amendment rights while at trial. There is. It has always been, to my knowledge, the Supreme Court has never ruled on a case regarding this, and my guess would be that it hasn't come up because we haven't had the system being used as it's being used in this instance, meaning it's not being used to protect the innocent or workaday person who happened to have seen a gangland style murder and is testifying against it, or some other thing that is sort of more typical in the criminal justice world, but it's being used to frustrate an American's, the leading contender for the presidency to run for the presidency. And so, yeah, we've got a rip in the time space continuum here, where a rule was implemented for, I think, entirely legitimate purposes, so that the accused couldn't frustrate the notions of justice that, we are hopefully, in the best sense of things, a trial is working through. And now we have this other, sort of dog's lunch that we're dealing with, which is them just throwing anything they can at Donald Trump, it seems like.
So it surprised me with the how novel this is then, that there isn't a challenge in place to the contempt of court from some of Donald Trump's solicitors.
Okay, so people in America don't know what solicitors are. You'll have to Americanize your English there, please. Yeah, well, it is. It's just that something that will be fixed later on after the presidential election. So the courts are not designed for some kind of rapid response, like, okay, the trial judge did X. Let's examine all these problems that occurred at the trial level. That's not how our system is set up. Our system is set up, we've talked before, Mark, on this program about some interlocutory appeals that have gone on, or appeals that take place before the trial is concluded. And that's a rarity. Our system is set up so that you get a trial, and if you don't like the decisions that the trial judge made, or they went against you and you're convicted, then you can appeal those decisions. But before then, even if it costs you the presidency, it's not set up for like, oh, well, let's integrate in our decision making that this may cost a person the presidency. And then, of course, the corollary to that is frustrate the will of, if it would in fact cost them the presidency, the American people to elect a president of their choosing, perhaps. So that's just not baked into our system.
It seems a bit of an oversight, to be honest, Scott, because
I don't know, man. We've how many hundred years are we down the road in this republic without having confronted the issue?
Well, my point is, Scott, that if this does indeed frustrate Donald Trump from the presidency, it seems like a surefire way that some, I'm not saying this particular president now, but some less moral president in future might think, hey, keeping my opponent in court and wrapped up in having his free speech rights curtailed.
Well, Mark, our system, the U.S. system, depends entirely on most of the significant actors not being corrupt, self-dealer power brokers, but instead having some kind of greater good in mind and adhering to their obligations under the Constitution. And to the we don't have a system that's set up to deal with somebody who's just willing to do whatever they want to get power, especially if there's multiples of those peoples. In other words, it's not just perhaps a prosecutor, but the entirety of the prosecutor's office, or the prosecutor and a judge, for instance. We're just not set up to as bulwarks against those realities. That's all what's coming to fruition now, and I don't know that our system can survive it if pressed to the wall on these things, because it's not set up for that. And if you think about the practicality of how that would work, what would we have? A special Supreme Court window at the courthouse for Donald Trump appeals, where like every day there's a new thing. Okay, here's the latest gag order. Does this meet constitutional muster? It's kind of preposterous.
Although perhaps even necessary. Scott DeCosenza, we'll be right back with you after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril. Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, discussing the trials of Donald Trump. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the gag orders and the constitutionality of them. But now I want to dive a little bit into the same case, New York, hush money case, Scott. I want to dive into what the witnesses are presenting. Now, we touched on this briefly, that for some reason, the prosecution has brought in Stormy Daniels, who has no bearing on how Donald Trump filed his paperwork.
Mark,
but
all the headlines are going to be rich with the name Stormy Daniels and reporting salacious details about Donald Trump stepping out on his marriage with her. So,
because that's relevant to how one files one's paperwork. We need to put we need our excellent post coordinator and editor Frank Diaro to put a little sarcasm button right here, ding, when it comes in. But let's talk about the other witnesses we've had so far. So you and I were discussing something quite interesting about the.
Well, let me just stop right there, because I think it's a point worth kind of drilling down on, which is, I was being sarcastic. I think the point of bringing in Stormy Daniels is for the prosecution to get Stormy Daniels' name in all the papers again. It's an unflattering experience for Donald Trump across all markets. For people he wants to see him in a favorable light, and he's trying to generate support for his campaign for the presidency, let's recall. And so anything that kind of smears that even a little bit is a big win, I think, for certain crowds. And so if we believe that the prosecution of Donald Trump in this hush money case is political, meaning and devoid of, a kind of quest for justice or something like that, and I do believe that to be true, then it just seems to fit right in naturally. Like, why would you call this person whose testimony has no bearing on whether or not Donald Trump, submitted a certain regulatory form in a certain manner and accounted for spending in a certain way? That's what the case is legally about, right? It's not about whether or not there was a confidentiality agreement in place. That's undisputed. So why is what is her testimony? What value is it? Well, it's of extreme value if you want all the newspaper headlines tomorrow and to read about Stormy Daniels and her dalliance with a married Donald Trump.
Alleged dalliance. Let's go there. So there's also another couple of the witnesses that were in. We've had David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, amongst other publications, I believe. Now, you and I had an interesting conversation about this to do with his testimony, and give me the skinny on it, Scott.
Well, I saw many reports that indicated that Mr. Pecker's testimony was sort of trouble for Donald Trump, because David Pecker said that Mr. Trump was motivated by his election concerns in the 2016 presidential election for suppressing stories of extramarital affairs, basically. And I didn't understand why anybody was reporting that, because what's important as a corollary to Donald Trump's criminal prosecution is that Trump illegally made payments and used contributions to benefit his campaign. But whether Mr. Pecker thought that that was the motivation behind it or not is no bearing on whether Mr. Trump did. And Mr. Pecker's testimony was not, it would be one thing if he said, oh, yes, Donald Trump told me he didn't care if Melania found out about this stuff or his kids or close associates. He didn't care a whit about that. He only cared that potential voters would be off put by the story's reporting. Now, if that were true, that would be a damaging bit of a testimony for Donald Trump, but that's not what happened. It was just Mr. Pecker's own understanding of the beneficiary of the information. And so I just don't understand why it's relevant. And of course, properly classified, a jury should not find it relevant because, again, it's only relevant if Donald Trump did. And of course, this is it's almost difficult to talk about because really at the end of the day, you might say, well, it doesn't make any sense. And of course, that's right. It doesn't make any sense because what makes sense is people who are using the power of their office to get Donald Trump is what it seems to me is what's going on. And if you pass it through that lens, then things which kind of don't make sense in a strict law and order lens do make lots of sense. So,
Scott, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the crux of this comes down to if Donald Trump only did his classification of paperwork for an entirely legal process, if he did the classification of his paperwork with the sole intent of winning the election and not with any intent to save personal or professional embarrassment, then that's what has to be proven to prove that he acted illegally, right?
Well, here's the problem with that.
So you
Mark.
have to be, sorry, just
that's a federal charge.
You have to essentially look into the mind of Donald Trump to find criminality.
Yes, and you can't even do that because the election interference issue is a federal crime.
Okay, and I've got one final question, and this does kind of tie in with the gag order thing we were talking about earlier. Some of Donald Trump's gag order, contempt of court fines were related to Michael Cohen, who is and he called him a known liar. Isn't that just public record?
Convicted perjurer, by the way. I mean,
yeah.
Known liar is one thing. Convicted perjurer is an entirely higher order of a person who, you have to take judicial notice of their lying. We're talking about court testimony.
We'll be following what happens with Mr. Cohen in the courts on the pages of libertynation.com. Scott Cosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests for today's show, Tim Donner and Scott D. Cosenza. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the audience, for joining us and taking the time to listen in. I'll leave you with a final thought from B.R. Ambedkar, who said, quote, "The law is not a light for you or any man to see by. The law is not an instrument of any kind. The law is a causeway upon which, so long as he keeps to it, a citizen may walk safely. Law and order are the medicine of the body politic. And when the body politic gets sick, medicine must be administered." Now, those are wise words indeed, and I'm sure we all agree. But to quote one of the greatest Scottish bands of all time, Delamitri, sometimes it's the medicine itself that makes the pain. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you next week. Take care. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.